Research is hard, but your tools should not be. Subthesis.com is the free alternative to expensive software. Whether you need to calculate Cronbach's alpha or organize your field notes, Subthesis has a tool for it. No paywalls and no registration required. Check the link in the description and let's dive into today's lesson. Welcome to this essential exploration of critical thinking in graduate studies. Critical thinking is the foundational skill underlying all scholarly work. Every research question you develop, every source you evaluate, every argument you construct, and every conclusion you draw depends on your ability to think critically. Yet critical thinking is often poorly defined and rarely taught explicitly. Many students arrive at graduate school assuming they already think critically because they performed well academically. But academic success based on comprehension and recall is different from the analytical rigor graduate work demands. Today we will define what critical thinking actually means, distinguish it from related but different concepts, and provide practical frameworks you can apply to your scholarly work. More importantly, we will explore how to develop critical thinking as a habit of mind, a default approach to engaging with ideas, rather than a skill you activate occasionally. This transformation in how you think is perhaps the most valuable outcome of graduate education. By the end of this session, you will have developed understanding and skills across 4 key areas. First, you will be able to define critical thinking precisely and distinguish it from criticism, negativity, and excessive skepticism, which are common misconceptions that undermine productive scholarly engagement. Second, you will learn systematic frameworks for evaluating arguments and evidence that you can apply consistently across different types of sources and claims. Third, you will become familiar with common logical fallacies and weak reasoning patterns so you can recognize them in others' work and avoid them in your own. Finally, you will understand how to develop critical thinking as a habit of mind, integrating analytical approaches into how you naturally engage with ideas rather than treating analysis as an occasional formal exercise. Let us begin by clarifying exactly what critical thinking means. Critical thinking is the careful, deliberate evaluation of ideas, arguments, and evidence according to standards of logic and reason. It involves stepping back from immediate acceptance or rejection to examine how claims are supported, what assumptions they rest on, and whether conclusions follow from premises. Critical thinking examines 3 key elements: assumptions, evidence, and reasoning. Every argument rests on assumptions, often unstated. Evidence may be strong or weak, relevant or irrelevant, accurately represented or distorted. Reasoning may be valid or contain logical gaps. Critical thinking scrutinizes all 3. The disposition of critical thinking is open-minded but rigorous. You approach new ideas willing to be persuaded if the argument is strong, but you demand that arguments actually be strong. Neither automatic acceptance nor automatic rejection characterizes critical thinking. Instead, you suspend judgment until you have evaluated the support for claims. The goal of critical thinking is justified beliefs rather than predetermined conclusions. You are not trying to confirm what you already believe or to find fault with what you dislike. You are trying to understand what is actually well supported by evidence and sound reasoning. This pursuit of justified belief, regardless of where it leads, is the essence of scholarly inquiry. Distinguishing critical thinking from common misconceptions helps you approach it correctly. Many students mistake related but different behaviors for genuine critical thinking. Critical thinking is not criticism in the sense of finding fault. The word critical in this context derives from the Greek kritikos, meaning able to judge, not from the modern sense of expressing disapproval. A critical thinker might conclude that an argument is excellent and well supported. Finding problems is one possible outcome of analysis, not the purpose. Critical thinking is not negativity or a disposition to reject. Some students believe being critical means being skeptical of everything and agreeing with nothing. This stance is as uncritical as accepting everything. If you approach all arguments already planning to disagree, you are not evaluating them fairly, but performing a predetermined conclusion. Critical thinking is not cynical skepticism that trusts nothing. Appropriate trust based on track record, expertise, and verification is perfectly rational. Refusing to trust anything means you cannot function in a world where we necessarily rely on others' knowledge. Critical thinking calibrates trust based on evidence. Critical thinking is not debate tactics designed to win arguments. Persuasion has its place, but if your goal is victory rather than understanding, you will prioritize rhetorical effectiveness over truth. Critical thinking cares about what is actually well supported, even when that conclusion is inconvenient or conflicts with your prior position. Understanding argument structure is foundational for critical analysis. Arguments in the logical sense are not disputes but structured reasoning from premises to conclusions. The conclusion is the claim an argument attempts to establish. This is what the author wants you to believe after reading their argument. Identifying the conclusion clearly is the first step in evaluation. Sometimes conclusions are stated explicitly, sometimes they must be inferred from context. Premises are the statements offered in support of the conclusion. They are the reasons why you should accept the conclusion. Arguments may have one premise or many. Premises themselves may be obvious or may require their own support. Evidence supports the premises. In scholarly arguments, evidence might include research findings, statistics, case examples, theoretical principles, or other forms of support. Not all evidence is equally strong, and critical evaluation examines the quality and relevance of offered evidence. The inference is the logical connection between premises and conclusion. Even if all premises are true, the conclusion only follows if the inference is valid. A critical thinker examines whether the reasoning actually supports the conclusion claimed or whether logical gaps exist. Mapping arguments in this structure helps you evaluate them systematically rather than responding to your general impression. Not all evidence is created equal. Critical thinking requires evaluating the quality of evidence offered in support of claims. Several criteria help structure this evaluation. Source credibility considers who produced the evidence and whether they have relevant expertise and a trustworthy track record. A medical claim supported by peer-reviewed research from qualified researchers carries more weight than one from an anonymous website. This is not an appeal to authority fallacy. Credentials genuinely indicate relevant expertise. Methodology examines how evidence was gathered. Was the study well designed? Was the sample appropriate? Were controls in place? Are results replicable? A finding from a large randomized controlled trial is stronger evidence than an anecdote from one person's experience. Understanding research methodology helps you evaluate evidence quality. Relevance asks whether the evidence actually supports the specific claim being made. Sometimes evidence is true and high quality, but does not actually bear on the conclusion. A study about young adults may not tell us about elderly populations. Data from one country may not generalize to another context. Evidence must be relevant to the particular claim. Sufficiency considers whether enough evidence has been provided. A single study might suggest a conclusion but not establish it confidently. Extraordinary claims require more evidence than mundane ones. Critical thinkers ask whether the evidence base is strong enough to justify the confidence with which conclusions are asserted. Every argument rests on assumptions, and examining these foundations is essential to critical evaluation. Assumptions may be stated or unstated, factual or evaluative, obvious or deeply hidden. Stated assumptions are explicit premises the author acknowledges. These are visible and can be examined directly. Authors may argue for their stated assumptions or may present them as given starting points. You can accept, reject, or investigate stated assumptions. Unstated assumptions are hidden foundations that arguments depend on but do not articulate. These are often more significant than stated premises because they escape scrutiny. Critical thinking works to surface unstated assumptions and examine whether they are justified. Sometimes arguments fail not because of faulty reasoning, but because hidden premises are false. Background knowledge comprises widely shared beliefs that arguments take for granted. Arguments about climate policy assume climate science is legitimate. Arguments about economic policy assume certain economic relationships hold. These background assumptions are reasonable but worth noting because disagreement sometimes traces to different background beliefs. Value assumptions involve ethical judgments or preferences. Arguments that conclude we should do something always involve value premises, often unstated, about what is good, right, or important. When you disagree with a conclusion, examine whether the disagreement stems from different values rather than different factual beliefs. Values disagreements may not be resolvable through evidence and argument. Logical fallacies are patterns of reasoning that appear sound but actually fail to support their conclusions. Recognizing common fallacies helps you evaluate others' arguments and avoid errors in your own thinking. Ad hominem attacks target the person making an argument rather than the argument itself. Someone's character, motives, or identity does not determine whether their argument is sound. An unpleasant person can make valid arguments, and a wonderful person can reason poorly. Evaluate the argument, not the arguer. The strawman fallacy misrepresents an opponent's position to make it easier to refute. Instead of engaging the actual argument, the critic attacks a weaker version that no one is defending. Good critical thinking requires characterizing opposing views accurately and engaging their strongest formulations. False dilemma presents only two options when more exist. Either you support this policy or you do not care about children. Either we act now or catastrophe is inevitable. Most situations involve more than two possibilities. When presented with either-or framing, consider whether additional options exist. Appeal to authority claims something is true because an authority says so, without providing the evidence or reasoning behind the claim. Expertise is relevant but not sufficient. Authorities can be wrong, and experts disagree. Strong arguments show why a conclusion follows, not just who endorses it. Continuing our exploration of logical fallacies, let us examine 4 more common patterns of flawed reasoning that you will encounter frequently in academic and public discourse. Hasty generalization draws broad conclusions from insufficient evidence. 3 patients improved, so this treatment works. 1 program succeeded, so this approach should be adopted everywhere. Good reasoning requires sufficient sample sizes and consideration of whether observed cases are representative. Ask whether the evidence base is strong enough for the claimed generalization. Post hoc reasoning assumes that because one event followed another, the first caused the second. Latin name post hoc ergo propter hoc, after this therefore because of this. I started a new treatment and felt better, so the treatment worked. The economy improved after the policy change, so the policy caused improvement. But temporal sequence alone does not establish causation. Alternative explanations must be considered. Slippery slope argues that one action will inevitably lead to a chain of negative consequences. If we allow this, then next thing you know, disaster will follow. While consequences should be considered, slippery slope reasoning often assumes causal chains without justification. Each step in the alleged progression requires its own evidence. Circular reasoning, also called begging the question, assumes what it is trying to prove. The conclusion is essentially restated as a premise. This is true because it says so in this reliable source, which is reliable because it contains true information. Circular arguments provide no genuine support for their conclusions. Critical thinking in graduate studies specifically involves evaluating scholarly sources according to disciplinary standards. Learning how your field assesses quality helps you identify trustworthy sources. Peer-reviewed journals represent the standard of quality in most academic fields. Peer review means experts in the field evaluated the work before publication. While peer review is imperfect, it provides a baseline quality filter. Distinguish peer-reviewed sources from non-reviewed publications, popular media, and predatory journals that publish without genuine review. Publication venue affects credibility. Journals have reputations based on their selectivity, the quality of work they publish, and their impact in the field. Learning which journals are respected in your area helps you assess sources. Your advisor and coursework will reveal which venues carry weight in your discipline. Author credentials provide relevant context. Has the author published other work in this area? Are they affiliated with reputable institutions? What is their training? This is not to say unknown authors cannot make valid arguments, but established scholars with track records in a subject have demonstrated expertise, Consider credentials as context while still evaluating arguments on their merits. Recency matters because knowledge advances. A study from 20 years ago may have been superseded by better evidence. Check whether the source has been cited, and if so, whether citations are supportive or critical. In rapidly developing fields, older sources may be significantly outdated. In stable areas, classic works may remain relevant. Critical reading means reading for arguments rather than just for information. This analytical approach transforms how you engage with texts and prepares you to evaluate and build on others' work. Start by identifying the thesis or central claim. What is the author trying to convince you to believe? Sometimes this is stated explicitly in the introduction. Sometimes you must infer it from the overall argument. If you cannot identify the thesis, you are not ready to evaluate the argument. Map the structure of how claims are supported. What are the main supporting points? How do sections relate to each other? Is there a logical progression? Creating an outline or diagram of an argument structure helps you see both its strengths and weaknesses. Note the types of evidence used throughout. Are claims supported by empirical studies, theoretical reasoning, case examples, appeals to authority, or something else? Is the evidence appropriate to the types of claims being made? Are there claims that lack adequate support? Question whether conclusions actually follow from the evidence and reasoning provided. Even if all the evidence is accurate, does it support the specific conclusion claimed? Are there alternative interpretations? Are there gaps in the logical chain? This questioning is not hostile skepticism, but careful engagement with how arguments work. Critical thinking requires engaging seriously with views you disagree with rather than dismissing them. This intellectual charity strengthens your own thinking and enables genuine scholarly conversation. Practice steel manning, the opposite of straw manning. Instead of misrepresenting opposing views to make them easier to dismiss, present their strongest possible version. What is the best argument for a position you reject? If you cannot articulate why a thoughtful person might hold the opposing view, you do not understand the debate well enough to contribute to it. Seek to understand before evaluating. When encountering a view that seems obviously wrong, pause. What might the author know that you do not? What assumptions might differ from yours? What might make this view reasonable from a different perspective? Understanding why intelligent people hold views you disagree with often reveals complexity you initially missed. Distinguish strong from weak objections. Not all criticisms carry equal weight. A fundamental challenge to core premises is more significant than a quibble about word choice. When you critique, focus on what would matter most if the critique is valid. When you respond to critique, address the strongest objections rather than picking off only the easy ones. Be genuinely willing to change your mind when evidence and argument warrant it. If you approach disagreements only seeking to win, you will miss opportunities to learn. The hallmark of intellectual honesty is actually updating your beliefs when you encounter better evidence or reasoning, even on topics where you felt certain. Critical thinking must be applied to your own work, not just others. This self-scrutiny improves your scholarship and builds intellectual credibility. Apply the same evaluative standards to your own arguments that you apply to others. Is your evidence strong? Is your reasoning valid? Have you examined your assumptions? Are your conclusions appropriately qualified? Many scholars are more rigorous with others' work than their own. Consistency requires turning critical analysis inward. Actively seek disconfirming evidence that might challenge your conclusions. The natural tendency is confirmation bias, favoring evidence that supports what you already believe. Counter this by deliberately searching for evidence and arguments against your position. If your conclusion survives this search, it is stronger. If it does not, you have learned something important. Anticipate objections and address them in your work. What would a skeptical reader question? Where might someone disagree? Acknowledging and responding to potential objections strengthens your argument and demonstrates intellectual honesty. Ignoring obvious objections makes your work look naive or dishonest. Embrace revision as improvement rather than as admission of failure. Your first draft represents your first thinking, not your best thinking. Receiving critique and revising in response produces better work. Critical engagement with your own drafts, whether through self-review or feedback from others, is how good work becomes excellent work. Critical thinking is not just a skill, but requires certain character traits or intellectual virtues. Cultivating these virtues supports rigorous analysis and scholarly integrity. Intellectual humility acknowledges the limits of your knowledge. You do not know everything, your understanding might be wrong, and you can learn from others, including those you disagree with. Humility is not self-deprecation, but accurate self-assessment. It enables growth because you remain open to updating your views. Intellectual courage means following evidence and argument where they lead, even when conclusions are unpopular, uncomfortable, or costly. Sometimes evidence points to conclusions that conflict with your community's consensus, your prior beliefs, or your interests. Intellectual courage pursues truth despite social pressure or personal discomfort. Intellectual empathy involves genuinely understanding others' perspectives, not just as positions to refute, but as views held for reasons that make sense from their standpoint. This empathy does not require agreement, but does require taking others seriously enough to understand why they believe what they do. Intellectual integrity maintains consistent standards across contexts. You apply the same rigor to your own views that you apply to opponents. You do not exploit fallacies when they suit your purposes while criticizing them in others. You acknowledge when your arguments are weak rather than defending them through rhetoric. Integrity builds trust and credibility essential for scholarly contribution. Graduate seminars provide opportunities to practice critical thinking and dialogue with others. How you engage in class discussion reflects and develops your analytical capabilities. Listen actively rather than waiting for your turn to speak. Many people spend discussion time formulating what they want to say rather than genuinely hearing others. Active listening means you can accurately restate someone's point before responding to it. If you cannot summarize their position fairly, you have not listened well enough. Ask clarifying questions to ensure you understand precisely what someone means. What do you mean by that term? Could you give an example? Are you saying X or Y? These questions are not challenges, but genuine attempts at understanding that often reveal important nuances or unspoken assumptions. Build on others' contributions when possible. Instead of only raising new points or contradicting what has been said, show how your thinking connects to previous contributions. The phrase yes and signals that you are joining a collaborative inquiry rather than competing for airtime. Discussion should be collective thinking, not serial monologue. Disagree respectfully by challenging ideas rather than attacking people. I see that point differently, or I think the evidence suggests otherwise focuses on the intellectual content. That is wrong, or how can you believe that makes the disagreement personal? You can express strong disagreement while maintaining respect for your interlocutors. Critical thinking in community requires both rigor and courtesy. Human cognition contains systematic biases that undermine critical thinking. Awareness of these traps helps you avoid them, though vigilance is always required because biases operate unconsciously. Confirmation bias leads you to notice, remember, and favor evidence that supports your existing beliefs while ignoring or discounting evidence that challenges them. Everyone is susceptible. Counter this by actively seeking disconfirmation and taking challenges to your views seriously rather than defensively. Motivated reasoning works backward from desired conclusions to find supporting reasons. When you want something to be true, you are more creative at finding arguments for it and more critical of arguments against it. Notice when you are reasoning about something you care about and apply extra scrutiny to conclusions you find appealing. Tribalism judges arguments by their source rather than their content. If someone from your in-group says it, it seems more credible. If it comes from an out-group, you search for flaws. In polarized times, this is increasingly common. Evaluate arguments on their merits regardless of who makes them. The Dunning-Kruger effect describes how limited knowledge produces overconfidence. When you know little about a subject, you do not know enough to recognize what you do not know. As expertise increases, so does awareness of complexity and uncertainty. Maintain humility, especially in areas where your knowledge is limited. Critical thinking becomes powerful when it shifts from occasional deliberate analysis to a habitual way of engaging with ideas. Building habits requires practice across contexts until the analytical approach becomes automatic. Question routinely until it becomes natural. When you encounter claims, automatically ask, what is the evidence? What are the assumptions? Does this follow? Eventually, you will not need to consciously invoke these questions. They will arise spontaneously as you engage with information. Practice critical analysis on everything, not just scholarly reading. Analyze news reports for unstated assumptions. Evaluate advertisements for logical fallacies. Notice the reasoning in conversations and public discourse. Every encounter with claims is an opportunity to practice. The more you practice, the more natural critical analysis becomes. Reflect regularly on your own reasoning. Why do you believe what you believe? What evidence supports your positions? Where might you be wrong? This self-reflective practice is uncomfortable because it challenges certainties, but it is essential for genuine critical thinking. Journal about your reasoning or discuss it with trusted others. Sharpen your thinking through dialogue with others who also value rigor. Explaining your reasoning forces clarity. Hearing challenges reveals weaknesses. Collaborative inquiry often produces better thinking than individual analysis. Find intellectual community that supports rigorous, honest exploration of ideas. While critical thinking principles apply broadly, disciplines have specific conventions about what counts as strong argument and evidence. Learning your field standards is essential for professional success. Shared principles underlie all scholarly disciplines. Logic, evidence, and reason matter everywhere. Arguments should be coherent, evidence should support conclusions, and assumptions should be examined. These basics transcend disciplinary boundaries. Different fields have different standards for what constitutes a strong argument. Some fields value formal theoretical frameworks, others prioritize empirical findings, some privilege quantitative evidence, others accept qualitative approaches. Legal scholars and literary scholars both think critically but apply different evaluative criteria. Evidence types vary dramatically. Laboratory experiments, randomized controlled trials, archival research, ethnographic fieldwork, textual analysis, and philosophical argument all constitute valid evidence in their respective contexts, but would not necessarily transfer across fields. Strong evidence in one discipline might be weak or irrelevant in another. Learn your specific field's expectations through multiple channels. Ask your advisor directly what makes a strong argument in your area. Read exemplary work and notice what kinds of evidence and reasoning appear. Pay attention to what reviewers praise and criticize. Attend to how established scholars structure their claims. Disciplinary conventions are largely implicit until you make them explicit through careful attention. Critical thinking is not an end in itself, but enables scholarly contribution. Analysis creates the foundation for original work that advances knowledge in your field. Critique enables contribution by revealing gaps in existing knowledge. Through careful analysis, you identify where arguments are weak, where evidence is missing, where assumptions are questionable, and where questions remain unanswered. These gaps become opportunities for your original research and thinking. Synthesis across sources creates new insight that no individual source contains. By critically engaging with multiple perspectives, you can identify patterns, reconcile apparent contradictions, and generate understanding that emerges from the combination. Your synthetic analysis contributes something beyond what any source says individually. Original arguments emerge from the foundation of careful analysis. Having thoroughly examined existing work, you can position your own contribution precisely. You know what has been established, what remains contested, and where your work adds value. Your argument builds on, rather than ignores, what has come before. Develop your critical voice with appropriate confidence balanced by intellectual humility. You have done the analysis, examined the evidence, and reached conclusions. State them clearly while acknowledging uncertainty and limitations. Your voice should be heard in scholarly conversation, contributing your perspective while remaining open to correction and refinement. Let us consolidate the essential lessons from today's exploration of critical thinking in graduate studies. First, evaluate arguments systematically by examining evidence, reasoning, and assumptions. Ask whether evidence is strong and relevant. Ask whether conclusions follow from premises. Ask what assumptions, stated and unstated, the argument depends on. This systematic approach produces more reliable evaluation than gut reaction. Second, recognize logical fallacies both in others' work and in your own thinking. Learn the common patterns of flawed reasoning so you can identify them when they appear. Apply this recognition equally to arguments you agree with and those you oppose. Third, apply consistent standards across perspectives. Evaluate arguments on their merits regardless of source. Be as rigorous with your own views as with opposing views. Intellectual integrity requires this consistency even when it is uncomfortable. Finally, develop critical thinking as a habit of mind rather than an occasional technique. Practice on everything you encounter until analytical engagement becomes automatic. Cultivate the intellectual virtues that support rigorous thinking. Over time, this approach will transform not just how you analyze specific arguments, but how you engage with ideas generally. Critical thinking is perhaps the most valuable capability graduate education develops. It enables all your scholarly work and serves you throughout your career. In our next session, we will explore how to participate effectively in academic conferences, a setting where critical thinking takes public form. Writing the thesis is a marathon, not a sprint, but you do not have to run it alone. If you are feeling stuck with your data or overwhelmed by your sources, let us help. Head over to subthesis.com. It is completely free and designed to make your life easier. You are making progress. Keep going. And don't forget to subscribe for more support.